studies.
He has for a long time been fixated on dairy farmers in Canada. And he thinks the Canadian government is protecting a relatively small number of dairy farmers in Canada by putting, tariffs and quotas on U.S. dairy.
In most places, a glass of milk is just a drink. But between the United States and Canada, it has become a symbol of something much bigger: a growing trade rift, simmering political tensions, and two very different visions of economic sovereignty. At the heart of the conflict is Canada's dairy supply management system. This system sets strict quotas on production and imposes tariffs as high as 300% on imports that exceed those limits. It's designed to protect Canadian farmers, ensuring stable prices and domestic food security.
And here's my problem with Canada. Canada was meant to be the 51st state because we subsidize Canada by $200 billion a year.
Under the USMCA, successor to NAFTA, Canada agreed to open a portion of its dairy market to American producers through tariff-free quotas. But U.S. officials argue that the way these quotas are allocated makes it almost impossible for American companies to actually benefit. Quotas are being granted to Canadian-owned processors, they claim, locking U.S. suppliers out of the market by design. What was supposed to be a technical adjustment to level the playing field has become a source of frustration, mistrust, and ultimately, retaliation. In response to what it sees as unfair treatment, the U.S. government imposed broad tariffs on Canadian goods, targeting not just dairy, but also lumber, aluminum, and steel.
With this Canada, the people that, now this was Trudeau, the people that good old Justin, I call him Governor Trudeau, his people were nasty. And they weren't telling the truth. They never told the truth. You know that, they'd say, well, we don't charge. Well, they do. They charge tremendous. They charge tremendous.
Then came another flashpoint: Canada's 3% digital services tax, aimed at large multinational tech firms operating in the Canadian market, most of which are American. Washington condemned the move, calling it discriminatory and retaliatory, arguing that it unfairly targets US-based companies like Google, Amazon, and Meta. The reaction was swift. Canada defended the tax as a matter of digital fairness, while the US escalated pressure by threatening to pull out of ongoing trade talks. In the face of rising tensions, Canada rolled out a $6.5 billion Canadian dollar support package to help offset losses for its producers. At the same time, Ottawa introduced the One Canadian Economy Act, a plan to unify its fragmented domestic market by removing interprovincial trade barriers, ensuring internal economic resilience in case U.S. exports decline further. At this stage, the conflict had clearly evolved beyond dairy.
We find that they're charging us over 200% for dairy products. You know about that. And when I left, we had that well taken care of, but under Biden, they just kept raising it. Very difficult to deal with the Canadian.
The impacts are already being felt on both sides of the border. In Canada, public sentiment has hardened. Social media campaigns calling for the boycott of American products have gone viral. Supermarkets have begun pulling U.S. dairy and meat products off shelves. South of the border, American dairy farmers in key states like Wisconsin and Minnesota are facing severe losses. Without access to the Canadian market, millions of gallons of milk are now being dumped or sold at rock-bottom prices. Many family farms are teetering on the edge of financial collapse. Meanwhile, the tech sector is watching closely. If Canada's digital tax survives and succeeds, it could become a model for other countries, potentially triggering a wave of digital taxation across Europe and Asia. That would erode the profitability of American tech exports and create a patchwork of regulatory headaches. Legal experts are also warning that the dispute threatens the long-term viability of the USMCA. If either side brings formal complaints to the WTO or invokes retaliatory clauses, the framework of North American free trade could begin to unravel.
Last night I had a good conversation with President Trump, and we agreed to recommence our negotiations with a view to the 21st of July deadline.
This didn't start as a geopolitical crisis. It started with milk. But trade, in the modern world, is no longer just about goods crossing borders. It's about values, leverage, and who gets to define the rules of engagement. When partners become rivals and economic tools become weapons, the cost is rarely limited to tariffs and taxes. Trust is broken, markets shift, communities suffer. This isn't just about dairy anymore, it's about what kind of global economy we're building and who gets left behind when it breaks.
Canada, they were foolish to do it. So I said, we're going to stop all negotiations with Canada right now until they straighten out their act.
U.S. President Donald Trump repeating his rhetoric over Canada becoming the 51st state, days after saying trade negotiations between the two countries have ended.
It started with a sentence. President Trump declared, "We're done talking." In one abrupt move, he ended trade negotiations with Canada, America's closest neighbor and longest-standing ally. It wasn't just about taxes, it wasn't just about trade. What followed was something far more provocative. Trump said,
"It will be fun with Canada. I love Canada. Frankly, Canada should be the 51st state."
The shock wasn't just in the statement, it was in the timing, the tone, and the threat that came right after. New tariffs, 7 days, and zero room for compromise.
You know, this policy actually was introduced by the previous administration in Canada. It was bad policy then, and it's bad policy now. And now Carney has no income, so he's trying to find any way he can to make income.
At the center of the explosion was a tax, a 3% levy on digital services, introduced by Canada and set to take effect on July 1st. It targets major U.S. tech giants like Google, Amazon, and Meta. Investor Kevin O'Leary described the tax as a desperate measure, pointing to Trudeau-era energy restrictions as the root of Canada's revenue crisis. Though long in the making, planned since 2019 and passed into law in 2024, it was the moment of collection that triggered Trump's fury. According to estimates from Canada's Parliamentary Budget Office, this tax could bring in nearly $7 billion over 5 years. Trump didn't just oppose it, he viewed it as an attack, one that demanded immediate retaliation. And so, he slammed the brakes on all trade talks, warning that tariffs would be imposed on key Canadian exports within the week. But this wasn't just about big tech, it was about power, politics, and old grudges.
It's pure Trump. It's the way he negotiates. He throws live munitions at something and he hopes that something in his favor will come of it.
Trump has never hidden his disdain for Canada's supply management system, a framework that protects dairy, poultry, and egg farmers through quotas and price controls. It was a sticking point in the original NAFTA talks, and despite being enshrined in the USMCA agreement Trump himself signed, he's now calling it unfair. Then came the metals. Steel and aluminum are back in the firing line, industries that have seen tariffs rise and fall multiple times since 2018. To Trump, Canada is a dependent partner who enjoys U.S. market access without paying its dues. That's the justification he gives, not just for trade penalties, but for something even more dramatic. By suggesting Canada become the 51st state, Trump is using the language of absorption to assert dominance. Critics call it rhetorical theater. But for Trump, it's a power play, and it's a move designed to force a response.
You know, no one takes seriously here in the United States his talk about the 51st state, but he does seem to be using it as a form of leverage, or hoping that it could be used as leverage to get what he perceives to be a better deal.
While Trump turns up the volume, Canada turns inward. Prime Minister Mark Carney has avoided direct confrontation. Behind closed doors, senior officials continue quiet outreach to Washington, trying to salvage some path forward. The Canadian government shows no signs of abandoning its agricultural protections, a red line in every negotiation. But the digital services tax? That's another matter. Sources within the Canadian Finance Ministry, speaking on background to local media, have acknowledged the DST may be flexible if it leads to a broader deal. Meanwhile, Trump is under pressure. His 90 deals in 90 days campaign is running out of time before the July 9th deadline. His signature spending bill, nicknamed the Big Beautiful Bill, faces resistance in the Senate. And even Elon Musk, once a close ally, is publicly criticizing his economic priorities. Trump needs a win. Canada, for now, refuses to hand him one. So what's next? If Canada caves on the DST, a reset in negotiations is possible. If they hold the line, Trump could follow through on tariffs that would hit Canadian steel, aluminum, and dairy, damaging sectors already under pressure from inflation and slowing global demand. But the deeper risk is strategic. Trump isn't just testing Canada, he's testing the boundaries of trade diplomacy itself, turning up pressure, making personal demands, blurring the line between economic and political integration. In this high-stakes standoff, there are no easy outcomes. But one truth is clear. Trump is not negotiating for just a trade deal. He's negotiating for leverage, legacy, and the illusion of control. And while markets react and headlines swirl, it's workers, consumers, and families on both sides of the border who will carry the cost.
The president angry about Canada's new digital services tax. The president, as you see right there, calling it, quote, a direct and blatant attack on our country.
Carney was created by Donald Trump, and now he's his worst nightmare.
President Trump has pulled the plug. Just days after shaking hands at the G7, he abruptly ended trade talks with Canada, calling their new digital tax a blatant attack and promising new tariffs within 7 days. While Trump escalated the fight, Canada didn't flinch. Instead, Prime Minister Mark Carney played a quiet but deliberate card, one that could turn this trade dispute into something much bigger. Let's unpack what's happening behind the scenes and whether Canada can hold its ground or be forced to fold.
You know, there are different means that we could have delayed the implementation. The Prime Minister has wide powers to do these things, as does the Finance Minister. I think this may also have been a negotiating tactic on the part of Prime Minister Carney.
On June 28th, Canada officially began collecting its long-planned digital services tax, targeting major American tech companies like Google, Meta, and Amazon. The tax wasn't new. It had been legislated in 2024, debated since 2019, and structured to apply retroactively from January 2022. Carney could have delayed the payment deadline. He had the legal authority, but instead, he chose to proceed, fully aware that Trump would treat it as provocation. Insiders in Ottawa now call it a negotiating tactic, not a misstep, but a deliberate pushback. It was Canada saying, "We won't be bullied into silence." In dollar terms, this digital tax is modest. Canada expects to collect around 2 billion Canadian dollars in total, barely a fraction of the $800 billion in annual bilateral trade with the US. But for Carney, this wasn't about revenue. It was about setting boundaries, establishing that Canada has the right to tax global firms operating on its soil. Former finance officials now say, if needed, Canada could freeze or repeal the tax. But doing so without any US compromise would carry domestic political costs and send a dangerous signal of submission. Trump labeled the tax an attack. Carney treated it as leverage.
We're a natural resource superpower. If we're backed into a corner, we can use those to our advantage.
Trump insists the US holds all the cards. But Canada does have leverage, especially if things escalate. It supplies over 90% of the potash used by US farmers. It's a critical source of natural gas feedstock for American fertilizer production, and it controls key supplies of uranium and critical minerals, vital for defense and clean energy sectors. Canada also has trade options. Carney recently signed strategic deals with the European Union, and his government is actively expanding ties with India, China, and Southeast Asia, regions that, according to the IMF, will drive 1/3 of global GDP growth by 2027. But there's another side to this coin: economic pain at home.
Trade tensions stalled momentum in Canada's economic growth this spring and put a chill on business investment, hiring, and consumer confidence.
According to Deloitte Canada, the country is now on track for a mild recession. The report forecasts 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, driven in part by prolonged US tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and autos. Job creation has stalled. The hardest-hit sectors, manufacturing and auto, are already cutting back. And consumer confidence is dropping, dragging down housing sales and spending across the board. Even with interest rates at 2.75% and a likely cut from the Bank of Canada this summer, the economic outlook remains fragile. So the question is, with pressure rising, how long can Canada hold the line? Mark Carney faces a narrow path. He could withdraw the digital tax tomorrow. That might satisfy Trump, but it would undercut Canada's policy sovereignty and validate Washington's pressure campaign. Or he could hold steady and risk deeper tariffs that could ripple across Canadian industry. But Carney isn't playing to win a headline. He's trying to shape the long game: less exposure to U.S. retaliation, more resilience through diversification. Trump wants a quick deal. Carney is building insulation.
And when the president said, maybe we'll make Canada another state, he said, no, we absolutely will never do that.
This isn't just a spat over a tax. It's a test of strategy, leverage, and national resolve. Trump believes pressure always pays, but this time, Canada didn't blink. They played their card, and now they're waiting. The tariff letter is coming. And when it does, the real question won't be what's in it, but whether Canada backs down or shows Trump that even the small guys have cards worth playing.